Hawaii, and it speaks to the various canoes of indigenous peoples around the world. It says, "Let us face the long back seesaws or the long river currents. Let us see the stars, and let us be guided on the path of our ancestors." We are in interesting times, and there's much to be grateful for as we celebrate, the 75th anniversary here of our, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there's a lot to be done, and there's also a lot to be discussed since our panel today about what does that mean for indigenous peoples. There has been a lot of advances on behalf of Po'eoiwi or indigenous peoples from around the world, but there's also been a little bit of disadvantages. So our hope today is to be able to discuss those, both of those topics, and find a way that we can work forward and move forward together. I have a great panel here that we've assembled, and please hold your questions. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end, and we only see part of our panelists. We have a couple of panelists here that were not able to make the long trip, so they'll be joining us via Zoom. We have one that will be coming in from Africa, hopefully. She's been having some connectivity issues, so we're trying to get her on, and then we have yet another panelist coming in at about the half hour. Before we jump into our questions, I'd like to do a quick introduction of our panelists that we have here. We'll start with our brother Roberto Mucaro Borrero. He's Guainia Taino. He's the president of the United Confederation of Taino Peoples. He has over 25 years of experience actively engaged in the United Nations system in the thematic areas such as sustainable development, climate change, and indigenous peoples' rights. He has served on the staff of the International Indian Treaty Council and the American Museum of Natural History, as well as an independent contracting consultant for UNESCO, UNDP, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, PBS, and other notable institutions. He's a citizen of the Guainia Taino tribe of Boricua. That's correct? Yeah. And the Virgin Islands. In 2012, he was traditionally sanctioned as cacique, or chief of his tribe. Aloha. Next, we have Elsa Stematopoulos. She's the director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program, Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. She is the first director of Columbia University's Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. She teaches at the United Nations, almost all in the human rights field. She teaches human rights at Columbia University, after 31 years at the United Nations. She was the first chief of the Secretariat of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and had been working in this field for a very long time, setting the stage for so many to follow. Then we have our friend Pasang Dolma Sherpa. She's the director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, and has been working for over a decade to recognize Indigenous peoples' knowledge and customs in forest management, biodiversity, and climate resilience. She obtained her PhD in climate change education and has served in various influential roles in international climate change platforms, including UNFCCC and the World Bank. She is currently involved in multiple steering committees and advisory roles for organizations focused on environmental and human rights issues. And then we have our friend Pavel Sulinziga. Get that right. He's the president of the Botany Foundation, the International Indigenous Fund for Development and Solidarity, a Russian indigenous rights advocate of the UDHR nationality, and he's a member of the UN Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises. Tasked with disseminating the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Until 2010, he was the first vice president of the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North and a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Then joining us via Zoom, hopefully soon, connection pending, is our Maasai friend, Lucy Mulenke, who's a co-chair of International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And she's part of the Maasai Indigenous community in Kenya, and her expertise lies in the sustainable development of Kenya's indigenous pastoralist communities. And she has worked with more than 100 grassroots organizations in East Africa, and is a co-founder and co-chair of the Indigenous Women Biodiversity Network, and is an active member of the International Forum
on Biodiversity and International Forum of Indigenous Women. And then we have, last but not least, our friend who will be joining us also via Zoom from Alaska, Dr. Dali Sambodoro, who is Inupiaq. She was directly involved in discussion, debate, and negotiation on the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 1984 to its adoption by the UN General Assembly in 2007. She was also a direct participant in the 2-year revision process of International Labor Organization Convention 107, which resulted in the adoption of C-169 concerning Indigenous and tribal peoples in independent countries. She's the former chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and member of the UN Permanent Forum, and also co-chair of the International Law Association Committee on Implementation of UNDRIP. And these are my esteemed panelists and colleagues. I failed to introduce myself, and my name is Raymond Prakarsi. I'm your host and moderator for today. I humbly serve as the chair for Cultural Survival. I've been working in Indigenous rights advocacy throughout the Pacific, especially for our own people in Hawaii. How about a hand for our esteemed panelists? Okay, now that I got the formalities and stuff I got to read out of the way, we always get to the fun part, which is really why we're here, to have a discussion. To have a discussion, to come to understand it, get to a multiplicity of understandings, and then hopefully be able to find a solution. As we do this, we're so grateful for many of the human rights that we've benefited from in these last 75 years. But also understanding that human rights and Indigenous rights aren't always the same. You would think they are because we're all human. But a lot of it lies in who defines what human rights are and how they should be effectuated. There's always more sides to the story than one. So before we get started, just as an exercise, I'd like us to all put our hands in the air, pointing to the ceiling, waving like you just don't care. Okay, now take a look, pointing out, make a circle going clockwise to the right. Clockwise to the right, okay? As we're doing that, with the motion staying the same, slowly bring it down and keep going, bring it down below your eye level. Is it still going clockwise? Take a look. Is it still going clockwise? No, it's going counterclockwise, right? Well, that's our reality. See, the action did not change. Circumstance did not change. Your perception and where you're viewing it from did. And a lot of times when it comes to human rights, one of the things that for myself that we've seen, especially in the Pacific, is the greater good dialogue. The greater good dialogue, meaning we're all humans first. So we all need to do what we need to do for the benefit of all humankind. But who creates that definition? What is best for all humankind? A lot of Indigenous peoples have been around for thousands and thousands of years and have become one with their communities, one with their land, one with the nature, and have understood how to work hand in hand with the world around us, to survive, to coexist, not to have domain over the fishes of the sea and the birds of the air and the animals of the land, but to be one with them and to be a part of that. And for a lot of us, that's the worldview that we come from. So we're grateful for sharing a lot of human rights, but let us have dialogue to understand what does human rights mean for everyone, especially our Indigenous people who make up such a small percentage of the world, yet we steward such a large percentage of the world's biodiversity, which equates to a large percentage of the health of this island Earth that we all live on. So with that, I'd like to start our questioning with our panelists here, with Roberto. And we have about 7 minutes or so for these questions. But as everything ebb and tides flows, we go with the flow. So the question is, can you share some of the major achievements of the global Indigenous rights movement since the adoption of the UN of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And then what spaces have opened up for advocacy and participation? And how have those achievements impacted the lives of Indigenous peoples?
Well, that's a lot to cover, but thank
It
you.
is.
So hopefully, some of my colleagues here can expand on it if I leave something out. But I want to thank you for inviting me to the panel. So I say home, Abiel, thank you, brother, and thank you to Cultural Survival for putting this acknowledgement together on this 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's very important for us, and hopefully, as I continue to expand my comments, we'll see why it is important for us as Indigenous peoples. But you know, the engagement of Indigenous peoples as an international movement didn't just begin right after the universal adoption of the Universal Declaration. It actually started way before, in the 1920s, before even the United Nations was the United Nations. And we have two documented cases of Indigenous leaders going to that body to basically say that something was not going right for their peoples back in their homelands. And this was not a coordinated trip to this international body at that time, the League of Nations. They came to this realization independently. Just as Malcolm X many years ago said, it's not about civil rights, it's about human rights. They come to this realization. One was a chief from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy named Descahe, who came to talk about the issues and the lack of enforcement for upholding the rights of their people. And another one came from the other side of the world, T.W. Ratana, from the Maori people of Aotearoa or New Zealand. This is again in the 1920s. Both of them were not able to get into that institution. They were not welcomed, or the doors were not open for them. And so it takes a few years before the doors are finally open. And it takes a lot of struggle and a lot of effort on behalf of many Indigenous peoples. But they really set a stage, they planted a seed. And so after that time, after the adoption of the Universal Declaration, probably the first mention is an early mention in the late 40s about Indigenous peoples. But it's really not till the 1970s, the later 1970s, that Indigenous people start to make more of a visible impact in the international scene. There was actually a meeting in the Americas, in North America, at the Standing Rock Reservation in 1974. Some of you have heard of Standing Rock from recent times of what was going on with the oil crisis, but actually Indigenous leaders from North, Central, South America met in Standing Rock in 1974 to discuss the situation of Indian peoples, American Indian peoples. And they felt that one, they needed to unify Indigenous peoples throughout the hemisphere to move their issues forward, because they were not getting listened to in their home countries. So they thought that the next best thing to do, like Descahe and Ratana, was bring their situation to the international forum. And so they decided to start engaging with some of the human rights mechanisms that were at that time available for them in Geneva. And by 1977, there was actually a working group that was formed over in Geneva that was focusing more on Indigenous peoples. And around that time, 1977. So that's what you see. And you have to think about the context of what was going on in the 1970s. That was also a time of the power movements, Black Power, Red Power. You look back and you see in the Americas context, you see the takeover of Alcatraz, you see the Wounded Knee situation, but there's also uprisings in South America as well. And many human rights defenders lost their lives during that time to bring the issues of Indigenous peoples and also others to the forefront. So there you could really say that the movement really started to galvanize and get more organized. And it was then expanded not only for Indigenous peoples of the Americas, but Indigenous peoples from other regions around the world also were engaging as well. And so from that time, from that engagement, the organizations and the networks were getting stronger. And so you have this working group on indigenous populations that was at that time populations. Remember, different from the word peoples, they were just saying populations. And you have this working group that's formed. And as a result of that, you have the beginnings of you mentioned UNDRIP in your introduction. That's the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so that's where the seeds for that the beginnings of that started. And obviously, as many of you know, over 30 years of impact before it was finally adopted, right? Engagement before it was finally adopted. But you have, you mentioned the ILO Convention was another advancement for Indigenous peoples, especially ILO Convention 169, which was better than the previous version, right? There was also not only the establishment of that working group, but later on, it actually led to the establishment of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues about 2000. And after that, we have the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also have the establishment of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And again, all this didn't appear out of the goodness of the hearts of countries. This came as a result of really massive international mobilization of Indigenous peoples. I was much younger at that time, and I came towards the end of the adoption of the declaration when things started to move to the New York side before its final adoption. And I was able to really meet some now legendary Indigenous human rights leaders who have now since crossed over. And many of them took me under their wing. Have another mentor who's here on the panel who also, we engaged in the very beginning. There was no permanent forum like we have now. There was no real specific agencies to deal with Indigenous peoples. So we really engaged with the human rights mechanisms. And at that time, also, we would go to the Human Rights Office and the Office of the High Commissioner and engage there beforehand. I remember there was a group that was set up for Indigenous peoples and NGOs who were supporting at that time. And finally, we were able to achieve the International Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples, the International Decade, the first one, the second International Decade. So all of these things help to raise the visibility, but also set the standards. Finally, when the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, as you say, was adopted, that was probably it's still probably the most articulated form of the rights, expressing the rights of Indigenous peoples within the human rights framework, the human rights international law context. And one thing that you mentioned about why that was important, it's because that document focuses on collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Before that, the conversations around human rights were often seen as an individual exercise, the individual exercise of human rights, how those human rights affect the person. But collectively, there hadn't been anything articulated in that way to show the standard, to provide a guide for states or countries how to engage with Indigenous peoples. And so that was really a landmark. But I have to say that, for us, and we've known from that time that declaration represents the minimum standard for the enjoyment of our rights. And why I mentioned and I don't know how much time, probably wrap it up here, but I mentioned the Universal Declaration, but many of the rights that are articulated for Indigenous peoples or about Indigenous peoples, concerning Indigenous peoples within the Declaration, are directly related to human rights law, to other conventions. And you even see the relation of the right to self-determination is mentioned in the Universal Declaration. But it's also mentioned there. So that's an argument, and I'll end here with that. many peoples try to say, especially states or governments, country governments, that the declaration is an aspirational document. But some of us feel that that's not really the case because it's grounded in accepted international law. So it's not really aspirational as they would like to pretend when they get into these large movements. And of course, since then, we've had impact in the climate change, the Convention on Biological Diversity. There was a World Conference, et cetera. But I'll end there because I think that it went on a bit long there.
Well, never apologize for going a bit longer because, you know, especially with Indigenous discussions, I really appreciate you setting the stage, setting the history to how we got to this point. And then that really just sets up everyone else for a really good discussion. And I like that you reminded us that it's not aspirational, it's actual. And we just need to effectuate it. And bringing up Elsa as our next speaker, perfect segue. So also, similar question. Can you share from your point of view some of the major achievements of the global Indigenous rights movement since the adoption of the UDHR? And then, you know, where do you see spaces that have opened up for advocacy and participation? And how important is that on how these achievements have impacted the lives of Indigenous women worldwide?
Thank you very much, dear moderator, for your generous and warm welcome. Thank you, Cultural Survival, and also Ford Foundation for bringing us together. It's really a very special occasion, the 75th anniversary. I have put together some notes because in 7 minutes to tell you all the achievements is impossible. So forgive me for looking into my notes so that I can manage the time. The first thing that is an achievement is the very creation of the global Indigenous Peoples movement. And Roberto went through this. And it's one of the most robust social movements of our times. And in the middle of their diversity, Indigenous peoples were able to identify their common points and aspirations and create that movement. Second point, the movement has been keeping the moral high ground. Again, Roberto alluded to that. He said, it's based on anti-racism, based on anti-colonialism, and based on human rights. Third point, it's through human rights that Indigenous peoples came to the international arena because human rights provided the openness, was the open door there for their participation. And human rights contributes to the moral high ground of their cause. And in addition, and Indigenous peoples know this, human rights is a field that provides political visibility and draws the attention of states. Fourth point, the strategies of Indigenous peoples were and are aiming at winning hearts and minds, and you need to do both in order when you create a social movement like this, a social justice movement. Fifth point, creation of a solidarity movement parallel to the Indigenous movement. So Indigenous peoples created that movement as well. In other words, some states are part of it, some state officials, some officials of intergovernmental organizations, civil society like NGOs or academia. So a solidarity movement was created at the same time. Sixth point, creation of a major normative framework for Indigenous people's rights. And of course, it's the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and of course the ILO Convention 169. Seventh, and the major achievement of the movement is participation in capital letters. Through their advocacy, Indigenous peoples achieved the new exceptional procedures for participation, starting with the famous 1970s, 80s study of the problem of discrimination against Indigenous populations, and inaugurating an amazing participatory methodology for this study, where Indigenous people were able to contribute a lot, and then going into direct participation at the working group on Indigenous populations. And this was a total exception. It did not exist and still does not exist in other bodies of the United Nations. And from the working group, this participation became similar and direct at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the expert mechanism at the Convention on Biological Diversity and other fora, and also CBD, of course, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. And now, after the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, we are talking about enhanced participation, where Indigenous peoples would like to participate directly at the General Assembly of the UN and other international fora that concern them. And this is part of the expression of external self-determination of Indigenous peoples at the international level. And all these are spaces that Indigenous peoples, because our chair mentioned the spaces, yes, spaces that they open, that they convince states who are the guardians of their rules there at the UN, they convince them that this is a good thing to do. Eighth, it's the list that Roberto mentioned about the many institutional achievements of the indigenous movement at the international level. I will just add to what Roberto mentioned. I will add the establishment of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, 2007. In 2014, we had the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, 2019, Year of Indigenous Languages, and starting 22, last year, the Decade of Indigenous Languages. So amazing institutional achievement. And the ninth one is that the movement is sustainable over generations. There is a long-term political commitment of indigenous peoples, and you see that, intergenerational. B, substantive and broad engagement with human rights at its core. And C, devoting the required human and financial resources to do that, because this takes a lot of resources. About women, Chair, if you give me 2 more minutes. Indigenous women, how can I do this implement? Indigenous women were part of the indigenous movement from the very beginning, from the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, in the drafting of the declaration, major actors. And of course, today, another thing that they achieved is to create also their own movement within the movement to identify issues that are of special interest and importance for them. And of course, I want to mention a recent achievement, which in a sense summarizes what Indigenous women have fought for. Last year, they achieved, and through the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the adoption of a general recommendation on Indigenous women and girls, General Recommendation 39. And it's so special. They participated so much over a decade to do that. And they have identified the issues there where they think basically that better action is required. And when I asked myself, okay, this general recommendation, which is so beautiful, does it touch our Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Is it good enough that way? I have dared say yes, because it managed to talk about intersectionality, individual and collective rights that Roberto mentioned before, self-identification as part of the, not definition, but self-identification of indigenous peoples, of course, violence against indigenous women and girls. And the last thing I will say before I close is that the Permanent Forum has created a permanent item. Almost every year you can go and discuss the follow-up about indigenous recommendations regarding indigenous women. So indigenous women are very strong and are here to stay. Thank you, Chair.
Well, just to really reiterate the indigenous women's movement, yes, it's here to stay. Yes, it's dealing with some very important issues. But I can't thank you enough for reminding us that indigenous women have always been at the table and been very important in dealing with indigenous rights from the very beginning. And many we talked earlier about our dear friend and one of my aunties that we love so much, Auntie
Yeah.
Mililani, being one of those, what we term in North Pacific, one of a him. Thank you for being one of them as well. Did we, to our IT people, were able to get our Maasai sister on yet? Okay. Okay, so we'll bypass this question for now. And the next question will be, for Hassan. We, we've talked about a lot that we've been able to achieve, a lot that we've seen, a lot, of movement forward. But we're still not even close to the finish line. There's still so much more to be done. So our question for you is, what are some of the most pressing human rights challenges that Indigenous peoples continue to face in Asia? Are there specific examples you could share with us?
Thank you so much, Austin. Also, I'm very thankful to our Cultural Survival and Food Foundation for your invitation and the opportunity to be part of the distinguished, my dear brothers and sisters, to share their own journey and also experience how important the human rights and what is the situation now and what need to be done. So I will just try to focus on these three peripheries. I totally agree and really thankful for Roberto and Elsa for sharing the global movements, especially the journey of Indigenous people. I began my career maybe more than two decades already, but especially working with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women, I started from 2009. So that's where, because in earlier also, I haven't worked with Indigenous people, but not really focusing on human rights aspects. When I started my journey in 2009, I just recall those days, especially following the climate change concerns and also partly also CBD also. In those days, just to include the name Indigenous peoples in a text was like a nightmare. That was my own experience. Because I still recall those days in the Substar, even in the COP, I just following the small text with this, government delegates requesting, excuse me, sir, can I have Indigenous people in your text? And some acknowledge and just like this, no? So that experience and then reflecting back my own experience that started, especially in this climate issues and concerns 2009. And now I just have back here from the COP28 in by that journey of around 15 years, it's really drastic change. Now after after Roberto said, like I started a long time back, and perhaps that rigorous efforts of Indigenous elders in the global arena, especially the benchmark for historical changes, especially with the Paris Agreement, people see when that recognize the human rights, especially rights of Indigenous people in line with the UN brief. And that was also a beginning of recognizing the platform and establishing the platform. And Delhi is there. She was representing from the Arctic, and I have been there representing Asia, and I happen to be the co-chair of the Global International Indigenous Peoples momentum on, especially with the LCIP of the UNCCC constituent bodies. So, just recalling in the 2 decades of struggle of Indigenous people, especially after 1992, when even our elders were struggling just to get a space. And that moment in 2018, when I was nominated as a co-chair, the scene was drastically different because the scene started like the Indigenous people working on the same table as the government delegates to speak your rights issues, you speak your knowledge, values, and practices. And that was the really historical changes. And I reflect by my own struggle back home. I am the first Indigenous person actually in Nepal, really started with the Indigenous issues on the climate change. And I really put my efforts to do my PhD also on Indigenous issues, especially climate change education in relation to interfacing with Indigenous knowledge. And when I submitted my proposal, the faculty members, they rejected my proposal because they were suggesting to delete Indigenous people. Why Indigenous people? Just say like, women is okay, but why Indigenous people? Not demand in our market. That was what I was suggesting. So see, the global is there, but at the national level, that was my own experience. And it delayed almost for 2 years in my PhD submission. And then I started exploring internationally. I almost ended up somewhere else. But then I found the right person to do it. And now in the 15 years time, no, not in 15, 12 years time, when I started my PhD in 2012 and 2023, now in Kathmandu University, where I have been a faculty members and teaching university, and now we have a first time establishment of master's program on indigenous studies. So yeah, so I like every efforts we do at the global level is so important to have this implication on the national level. And teaching is my passion. I have been teaching throughout my life. I have been teaching throughout my maybe more than 20 years now. I have been teaching in Kathmandu University. I have been teaching since 2011, and I never left teaching because I really want to make sure that every time I speak, I encourage young generation how important the indigenous knowledge and cultural values and to be protected and have that faith on it to go back to your roots and be proud of it, And that aspect now we could incorporate in our curriculum. And that is what I feel so proud that now we have 23 students in Kathmandu study for the first time studying in Indigenous Studies program. And now in collaborating with the UBC, also University of British Columbia, and also other universities around the world. And that has given another form. And now I just would like to wrap up with the global level struggle is there, but some kind of improvement. And the national level, we can also see kind of lenses of hope. The people are really sensitized because of the influence. However, I just visited few communities. It's part of my ongoing research with the World Bank. I have been leading one research on the indigenous-led research, especially with the indigenous resilient to climate threats. And in the past 2 months, I have traveled one community to another country in Asia, South Asia, especially Nepal, Pakistan, and India. The situation of indigenous people, especially the situation of indigenous women, you cannot imagine. I was pretty aware, but when you go in the grounds, oh my goodness, we talk about the human rights, even 1% of the human rights is not being there. So this is the very bitter experience because the lands is being detached, evicted indigenous people, and all the lands and the resources that is the pool of knowledge and survival and identity is not there. When the land is being detached, when they start a displacement in the name of the conservation, in the name of national park or conservation or different forest regime, that's where the beginning of the painful stories of indigenous people. And I will just give you one small story, and then I'll end for remaining question later. When I visited Kharia communities in one of the communities in Simlipal National Park in Odisha in India, the displacement is still now happening. In Nepal, displacement happened even in COVID time, and without, it's all false, false illusionary kind of commitment. You will have a good education, you will have an employment opportunity, you will have a, health security. When I visited 70 households that have been recently displaced, they are really in a nightmare and despair. You enter in the new settlement, children are just playing cards and the youth are just drunk because nothing to do it. No job, no, and all the indigenous women with the babies holding, just crying out, do you think we can have a drinking water? What way to human rights? And then I told them and they were telling me almost all the women got sick and even the children. And I told them are you still using the traditional medicine? And they said, the food we are provided now is not indigenous food anymore. We are living in the forests and nature. And we have our own food production, fruits everywhere. And now we are given a rasan. Rasan is like a rice, it's almost rotten rice. And that becomes very chic. And even our traditional, herbs doesn't work anymore. It's becoming like something else. Is this the humanity we are looking for? So this is the really right time with the proposal of how important to build the awareness and capacity building not only indigenous people, but the state parties and negotiator and different layers of agencies, how important indigenous peoples, to maintain their faith and values, and also indigenous peoples, this organization need to be strengthened, We cannot always keep on saying, oh, indigenous people are vulnerable. How about coming up with indigenous people are key actors? Because indigenous people are not only vulnerable or beneficiaries. Indigenous people are key actors for the solution for humanity to deal with this whole global crisis. Then also very important to map out, who are the agencies who are still behind for making the painful stories, the struggle, not even meeting 1% of human rights on the ground of indigenous people to live with just respect and with the hope of continuity of traditional knowledge and values. And that is the basis for climate resilience. And finally, very important to build the collaboration of indigenous people organization and keep on momentum of communication and support each others, and for making indigenous people to live with hope and respect in the own community, and especially for continuation of our knowledge and values by the indigenous.
Very important reminders, not just of the plights that we have, but the power that we have and where we are as actors, as key actors. Yes, victims to a certain extent of a lot of like colonizing our diet, you shared, but not victims in the sense that we have a voice and we have many answers in our own traditions. Thank you for that reminder. Next, we'll move on to our friend Pavel. A similar question. What are some of the most pressing human rights challenges that indigenous peoples continue to face in Russia? And what are some examples?
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much for organizing the meeting.
Я на самом деле буду говорить не только примеры.
I'll focus on examples that I'll mention.
Ну, вот сегодня вот друзья, коллеги говорили о том, что мы достигли, как
Today, my colleagues and friends, Roberto, discussed the achievements of our movement forward.
я могу сказать, это абсолютно правда, Россия идет по плану.
I speak adamantly Russia's trajectory, and Russia is going backward.
То сейчас это репрессивное государство.
Today, it's a repressive state.
Путинский режим это тоталитарный.
Putin's regime is a totalitarian regime.
Конечно, к сожалению,
Fortunately, we forget about human rights.
я организация, об этом не помню. В 2015 и признаны.
In 2015, my organization, the Batini Foundation, was declared a foreign agent in Russia, and in 2016 was closed down by the government for supposedly violating local legislation.
Я лично
I am now personally also declared a foreign agent.
1 ноября я получил
And now I'm facing yet another persecution in Russia. I've just received a summary of the court report.
есть вот несколько еще примеров. Да. Совсем недавно был арестован ФСБ Руслана Габаса.
Some other examples, very recently, the FSB has detained the brother of Ruslan Gabasov.
Руслан Габасов это башкирский активист.
Ruslan Gabasov is a Bashkir activist who had to leave Russia as well.
Его брат живет в деревне, жил в деревне. Никакой активности.
His brother was living in a village and was not involved in any political activities. He was a tractor operator on a farm.
25 ноября его рано утром пришли, арестовали и сказали, что
On November 25th, he was detained. He was visited by the FSB, and he was told directly that he would serve the sentence in place of his brother.
в сегодняшний день возбуждено 4-е уголовное дело против шамана Кечина. Священное озеро.
The shaman Kechenov, who is defending his ancestral lake from an oil development, he's now facing a 4th legal case against him.
Сегодня вот дата членом райкома.
Today it was mentioned that I was a member of RIPON, which is an umbrella group uniting indigenous groups in Russia.
2013 года является подразделением
Starting in 2013, RIPON has become is now incorporated into the Russian government and the FSB.
представители райком являются одним из тех людей, которые доносят.
RIPON's representatives are routinely submitting reports to the police about indigenous leaders across Russia.
Например, президент райком написал на меня заявление.
For example, the president of RIPON has denounced me and has submitted a report about me personally, accusing me of separatism in Russia.
Причем уголовные дела по заявлению райкома.
And such reports routinely lead to actual prosecutions in Russia.
Например, сейчас у нас уже есть случаи, да, когда представители райкома ходят за юридического количества, которые являются членами ходят за ними, фотографируют, снимают их на видео, тем они из иностранных.
We know for a fact that RIPON representatives who attend international events, including in the UN Forum, are following other indigenous leaders who are not members of RIPON. So the RIPON representatives are trying to document their meetings with foreigners and various discussions in the public sphere at these international events.
Так было на сессии экспертного механизма.
We saw this in Geneva at the session, the expert mechanism session.
Вы написали в службу безопасности.
We addressed this with the UN authorities, including the security staff, but unfortunately, we got nowhere with our request.
Сейчас такое же произошло на КОП-28.
Same thing, same situation occurred at the COP28 in Dubai.
Вы написали опять службу безопасности ООН.
And again, once again, we raised this with the organizers, security personnel, and this time RIPON was officially warned that they were not allowed to film other participants without their consent.
Я могу сказать, да, что, к сожалению, многие защитных организаций, организаций коренных народов не очень знают, да, политику России на народном уровне, только пропаганду.
Unfortunately, many people in the West, including those who are involved in international instruments and the United Nations bodies, don't fully understand Russia's approach and politics on the international stage, including the propaganda element of the country's engagement.
До сих пор некоторые вставляют райком как статус народа, хотя 100%, что это организация правительства, которая продвигает.
Many continue to view RIPON as a legitimate body representing indigenous people, yet it's a full-on governmental group that promotes the interests of the Russian government.
Недавно вышла статья про коренные народы. Написал ученый.
Recently, an article about indigenous people was published in Russia by a scientist.
Этот ученый не специалист по коренным народам, ученый по военному делу и безопасности.
But this was not an expert in indigenous rights or history. This was an expert in military studies and strategy.
Такие. Почему он написал эту статью? В этой статье четко пишет, что мы должны использовать коренные народы России, продвигать через них свои интересы, свое видение в международном мире. Нашей мягкой силы.
So he advocated for using indigenous people as an instrument of soft power in order to advance official interests.
И последнее, о чем я хочу сказать, да, была программа по правам коренных народов, для коренных народов, которая включалась в себя тренинги в Москве, коренных народов.
Another example is there was a program that promoted trainings for indigenous representatives in Moscow and in Geneva, the High Commissioner's office.
Эта программа сейчас запрещена.
That program is now shut down,
В том числе по причине того, что хотя сам райком, да, правительство России отбирает кандидатов в числа коренных народов, но часть людей, которые приезжают в Женеву, и слушают, да, права коренных народов о том, что делается, и возвращаются в Россию и начинают задавать неудобные вопросы.
so this program is shut down partly because although RIPON is responsible for selecting all individuals for participation, people who go to Geneva are routinely coming back with Russia, asking uncomfortable questions because they experience a different approach and they hear about indigenous people's rights in Geneva.
И поэтому сейчас эту программу
This program was financed by the Russian government.
сейчас эту программу закрыли.
Now it's closed,
Но теперь ее открыли только в Москве.
though the Moscow part still continues. So the trainings do take place in Moscow.
Они обучают их только в Москве. И
Trainings are relying on propaganda and the setting that.
поэтому, к огромному сожалению, сегодня говорить о коренных народах
Fortunately, it's nearly impossible to discuss indigenous people's rights or human rights in Russia today.
я последний
Two more examples. Final.
что эти репрессии уже касаются не только политических активистов, не только лидеров коренных.
Such repressions are not just affecting the leaders of indigenous movements,
Я принес сюда вот это вот изделие, да,
this is an example of craft.
это изделие сделал один из лучших представителей коренных народов по дереву, кости.
This is one of the leading craftsmen who works with stone and woodworker,
Он не занимался политикой,
not engaged in political activity at all.
он просто начал задавать неудобные вопросы.
He started asking uncomfortable questions,
Его за это уволили сразу.
for which he lost his job, he was fired.
Его детей хотели забрать в армию,
His,
слать на войну.
they wanted to draft his children into the military and send them to the war,
И он вынужден
so he had to escape Russia and he left
был спасти.
in order to save his family.
И вот это вот он вырезал уже здесь.
Currently here in New York, this is an example of this is a piece that he did here already.
То есть Россия не щадит никого.
So Russia doesn't forgive anyone. That's the situation.
All over the, it hits to home, really, how the activation of rights and ability is so different around the world. And our prayers are with you. We'll move on back to North America. We have Dalit on the line. And Dalit, if you could share with us your thoughts as well on what are some of the challenges, human rights challenges that are facing North America and the Arctic.
First of all, allow me to thank Cultural Survival and the Ford Foundation for this opportunity to share some remarks about Indigenous human rights in the context of the Arctic. I'm really pleased to see my brothers and sister there as panel members and sharing their perspectives as well. Many are longtime friends. In particular, thank Pavel for his frank assessment of the conditions facing those in Russia and unfortunately those from their traditional homelands that are now outside of those nation-state boundaries. First, allow me to say that I remember in 1998 during the intersessional meetings to draft the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that we had the opportunity to address the 50th anniversary of the UDHR. And I remember helping to write the speech that was going to be delivered by an Indigenous representative on that occasion. And the key messaging was, wouldn't it be something if every Indigenous person had the real opportunity to exercise and enjoy the rights affirmed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And if in fact that were the case, in all likelihood, the UDHR, in combination with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, those three instruments, that International Bill of Human Rights, Indigenous peoples wouldn't need the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? The international covenants affirm the right of self-determination as understood in international law. The UDHR raises the individual rights of all human beings. And so that was the nature of the speech that was given in, again, this context of negotiating the UN Declaration. I think one of the key challenges for Arctic Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples in North America, but I think indeed globally, is implementation of the UN Declaration. We've just heard from Pavel about the context of the need for respect and recognition of the rights of Arctic Indigenous peoples across Russia and elsewhere in Russia. So in many ways, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone must understand that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a universal instrument as well. Even though we may have states who assert that there are no Indigenous peoples within their borders. Take Iceland, for example, an Arctic state that we as Inuit have had to deal with. They too have to treat and encounter and address and support the human rights affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indeed, as a UN member state, they have a responsibility to do the same. And by this, I mean, for example, Korea. I was on a panel last night concerning Arctic research. They too should be encouraged to respect and recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples. So in this way, we are subjects and objects of concern to every single UN member state. And I'd like to thank Roberto for raising the matter of the legal status of the UN Declaration. We could have an entire workshop solely on that particular issue. But let me turn to the specific question. So we have implementation. If we think about tribes and tribal governments in North America and the Arctic, I'll take Alaska as an example. There are 229 tribal governments in Alaska alone. We make up over 40% of all the tribes recognized in the United States. I have to underscore that we have 144 of those communities and their respective tribal members that are threatened by climate change. I mean, all of us are threatened, but I'm talking about urgent threats. The relocation of communities because of collapsing permafrost, impacts to their food security, a whole host. I mean, in fact, it's a long list of threats, and it creates a huge challenge that needs to be addressed not only at the UNFCCC, at the international level, but also at the national and, more importantly, at the community level. The related issue of protection and safeguarding the marine environment is another huge challenge. I mean, this is a spin-off effect of climate change, the kind of incursions and encroachments we've begun to see in the last 3 decades or more, increased vessel traffic, the loss of sea ice. And though we don't have, from our perspective, a distinction between the land and the coastal seas and the Arctic Ocean, protection of the marine environment, because of our reliance upon marine mammals that have sustained us for centuries, this is another huge challenge and goes right to the heart of our human rights, our interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible human rights. All of this is compounded by the extraordinary infrastructure deficit that we face. We live in the most affluent countries in the world, the most affluent UN member states in the world in terms of the Arctic region and North America. When you think of the United States and Canada, yet we have an infrastructure deficit that is causing all kinds of problems. If you think about a concrete example, and I was asked to provide a concrete example. We have 31 communities in Alaska that still do not have clean, potable water and sanitation services. Yet we live in probably one of the most affluent countries in the world. I mean, imagine, and many others that have had boil water notices because it's not safe to drink the water. And this also links to the false dichotomy between the developing world and the developed world, and further disenfranchises Inuit and other Arctic indigenous peoples, because we can't access the same kinds of resources as others, despite the fact that we're facing substandard conditions, which then also contribute to very, very poor healthcare and healthcare conditions as well, which is another deficit. I think that, much could be said about that alone. I'll conclude by pointing out the global interest in the Arctic, which has become a different kind of challenge in and of itself. The increased presence of ships, other vessels, the increased pressure, for lack of any other way to put it, those forces behind extractive industries, this constant focus, but even more significantly, and this is something that Pavel and others have begun to raise in the course of the panel discussion here, the focus on the Arctic in terms of the geostrategic and geopolitical climate that we presently live in. Indeed, our organization as Inuit, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, sprung from dynamics triggered by the Cold War. Those dynamics are now front and center, and we're seeing the increased pressure upon our traditional homelands and the imposition of the national borders that have created these dynamics and fuel these dynamics. In many ways, this really does create a challenge that indeed has local impacts, national impacts, and of course, international impacts. I'll just finally say that this ever-increasing presence in the Arctic and the interest in the Arctic is also found in the huge amount of money that researchers access about Arctic issues. And certainly we welcome the important kind of research that needs to take place across our homelands, but more importantly, research that needs to take place with our direct involvement so that we're able to contribute our distinct knowledge to find solutions to global challenges like climate change. One opportunity that we've had in this regard is to galvanize our forces and our Indigenous knowledge holders and try to create an opening to ensure that entities like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change raise their heads and look at us in terms of engaging our knowledge holders in the work that they're doing to influence what's happening within the COP 28 and elsewhere. But I think this is going to ratchet up, especially given that the Arctic region is suffering impacts at a much harder rate and a much faster rate than other parts of the world. So we as the original peoples of the cryosphere need to be involved for a whole host of reasons. And I'll stop there and look forward to offering some of my ideas as far as the discussion period is concerned. So, kuyanak.
Mahalo, baby. But as we've been hearing from the different regions of the world, some of the different the challenges that we're all facing. Before I was asked to moderate, I was asked to be a panelist and then provide some context on the Pacific. And what we've been hearing from other regions of the world is not much different than what's happening in the Pacific, although the context might be slightly different. It's interesting. We come from island nations throughout the Pacific, and when it comes to climate change, we're some of the first to be seeing it. We have one of my mentors comes from an island where the coconut tree is the tallest thing on the island. The rains that they get on their atolls sink into their really low aquifer. But as the ocean is rising, that aquifers are getting inundated and they're losing fresh water. We're losing our lands, access to our traditional lands, access to our traditional ways. In Hawaii, pre-contact, it was estimated that we had 1.2 million natives in the islands, 100% self-sufficient. Today, well, in the time of our Princess Kaiulani, our numbers dwindled to somewhere about 25 to 40,000. Every native Hawaiian today is a survivor of that 25 to 40,000. And our numbers have grown, but our access to land has shrunk. There's more native Hawaiians living outside of Hawaii than we do have back at home. We don't have access to our traditional lands, our traditional foods, our traditional ways. As a society, there's 2.2 million people in Hawaii, 98% reliant on imports for food. That's not sustainable. My ancestors, our ancestors, were one with nature. We caused it to rain on the dry side of the islands. A lot of us love coffee and we love Kona coffee, right? It comes from a region that is traditionally dry. The Westerners discovered this area. Our ancestors created it by changing the way the rain patterns happen so it would be lush and verdant. Much as we love our coffee worldwide, that could feed our people. We're losing access. There's more Samoans living in the city of Auckland in New Zealand than all of Samoa combined. We're being displaced. And as we move on to other areas, people seem to take our voices less seriously. Oh, you don't live there. Oh, no, you're urbanized, you're Americanized, you're Westernized. Then we have the identity crisis. Are you Polynesian? Are you Micronesian? Are you Melanesian? Back home, you hear Polynesian pride, especially around football. Samoa's number one export is football players to the NFL. But one of our mentors, Papa Mausch, when asked, Papa, what's the difference between Polynesian and Micronesians? The answer was, some white person drew a line. Our oceans connect us. They don't divide us like popular Western ideals. From our worldview, we are the largest nation on the earth because it includes the ocean. Yet, international water rights take food from our icebox and replace it with trash. That North Pacific gyre, more than twice the size of Texas, floating plastic. The phytoplankton, we get more oxygen from the ocean than we do from the land. That is being covered. That's leading to climate change. We're suffering from it. We have traditions on how to change things and how to stop things. But our voices are heard less and less. Because we are not these distinct nations. Or we're those people from the Pacific. So for us, one of our challenges is being able to have this voice, even though we're small people, have this large voice. Have a voice that's united enough to represent us from the Pacific, yet diverse enough to understand that what's happening in Rapa Nui, slightly different from Aotearoa. It's slightly different from the Philippines. It's slightly different from Satawal, the tiny island of my mentor. Slightly different from my islands. We face many, many challenges. But what I do love is the opportunity we have to be here to also create solutions. Solutions that will work for all. And with that, we have just one more region to hear from, and that is our Latin America and the Caribbean. So, Roberto, what are some of the challenges that you see for Indigenous peoples effectuating rights?
Well, thank you very much. I think that one, it's really important to highlight let me put it this way. While the UN has gotten really good about articulating rights, I think Daley and others have already mentioned that the implementation of the rights is the real issue. The UN is not an enforcement body. I learned very early on from some of my mentors that we are the teeth for these documents. You know, it's up to us to really actualize and bring these documents, these norms to the forefront, because if we don't do it, who else is going to be doing it? We have to consistently remind states of their obligation. And in the Latin American and Caribbean context, when you talk about challenges, I could say this. If you look at the statistics for the actual death, assassinations of human rights and environmental defenders, Indigenous peoples top the list all throughout the Latin American region. So here we are, people on the front lines, fighting for lands, territories, resources that ultimately impact everyone else. But they're being assassinated with impunity all throughout the region. We're in also a context where we've come so far and we've seen this incremental advancements in the articulation of our rights, but yet we've also seen a reaction to that in the rise of a far-right movement that is now rolling back those rights. And people are really have an aversion to human rights. I've seen in the climate change, biodiversity areas where we work in, where we were made a lot of progress. Now there seems to be an aversion now to include the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in follow-up documents. You know, we had a win, so to speak, in the recent biodiversity convention conference, where we were able to get the words in there that said nothing within this framework can diminish the rights of Indigenous peoples that we now have or that we might attain in the future. However, I was just in Geneva at the biodiversity COP, and you know, there's a real aversion by some states to continue to. You have to continue to uplift this language in order to normalize it. But they see human rights. They see human rights as really impediment to their development process, right? You hear this in some rhetoric in South America by some of the leaders. Most recently, Bolsonaro said, oh, you know, I look up to the United States because at least they wiped out their savages and they were able to go ahead with their development. And, you know, that kind of rhetoric, now we just see what happened in Argentina. And that's an anti-human rights regime. And that's going to have an impact on Indigenous peoples. You know, with human rights, there's two things that can happen. Either they can be respected or they can be violated. Unfortunately, in the case of Indigenous peoples, we all often see violations, not uplifting. It's talked about, sure, but the actual implementation. And now, because of the uplift and these right-wing movements, racism now is also being normalized again in certain areas and certain instances. We hear things that we thought we weren't going to hear anymore, now coming back to the surface. So that's one thing that we see in the Latin American Caribbean region. And I'll end here by saying, Latin America and the Caribbean are all often combined, even in funding mechanisms and rights mechanisms. You hear the term LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean. However, in the Caribbean, there's a real, and I'm talking about the insular Caribbean, meaning the islands, because we're also island people. And the insular Caribbean is nearly invisible in the discussions on Indigenous peoples' rights, in the discussion on funding resources, except when they talk about Caribbean, Latin American Caribbean, you often hear only the Caribbean coast of South and Central America. Never hear about the insular Caribbean. So that is a challenge for us. Our people, there's only one Indigenous peoples community in the Caribbean that's recognized officially by their government, which is the Kalinago people on the island of Dominica. But then you have some softer recognition in Trinidad and Tobago, Carib people, and most recently, my community in the Virgin Islands was acknowledged by the governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands for the first time in 2021. So there's an invisibility of Indigenous peoples from that region happening, which makes it difficult for us to engage the systems. Because for my folks on the island of Boriquén, which you mentioned, which is now today known as Puerto Rico, if you look at the most recent U.S. Census, we're a very small minority of the overall Puerto Rican population. And yet they lump us in with North America. And Daley brought this up before, this dichotomy of developed countries versus developing countries, where we don't have access to the same resources within the UN system because we're tied to the US. And so we really don't get anything, as far as that. It's up to us to really raise that visibility. So I think for us, the main thing is from the region, I wanted to highlight the plight of human rights defenders and this rise of racism within the region as a whole. Is a real challenge for us. And also the invisibility of many of our peoples, especially in the insular Caribbean. Thank you.
And I also appreciate how you started off and it kind of tied us to what can we do, right? It's up to us, as you said, to take the actions, to really if we leave it to the governments, they'll recognize you have rights, but they won't do anything to help us actually attain those rights. So as we work towards building a future that fully respects and promotes the rights of Indigenous peoples, what are some actions or strategies that we can do, or each of us can do in our own regions that will help us get there? And what can our allies do to help us out? So this is a discussion area. So I'll just leave it open for whoever's inspired to speak first. And then we can build off of each other. But what are some of the strategies and actions we can do to fix the problem? Lily?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to share is something that Erica Diaz actually stated in the course of drafting of the UN Declaration, and that is education. I think what Roberto has just now said about the characterization of human rights, especially by the extreme right wing, what they often forget is the humans that those rights attach to, as far as their respective electorates, but even more importantly, that the very real language of the UN Declaration, for example, the preamble and profound spiritual relationship that Indigenous peoples have to their lands, territories, and resources. You can't simply call that a human right in this list of 46 different articles. There's so much that infuses this particular dynamic. So raising awareness about human rights isn't solely, making sure that we have copies of the UN Declaration, on the desk of every diplomat at the COP, for example, but for us as Indigenous peoples to really inform the content of those rights. And I really appreciated what was said about Hawaii and the Pacific, and it being one of the largest traditional territories on Earth. I really appreciate Melody McKenzie's work, this massive volume on Native Hawaiian law, a treatise. I mean, this book weighs, I don't know, like at least 10 pounds. The work that we're doing now on a treatise concerning Alaska Natives and American laws, and how these clashes that have to be dispensed with, but only through raising awareness at the local level, at the national level, at the international level, which brings me to the approach, and that is for Indigenous peoples to initiate their own research projects and to produce materials that will educate others, and significantly the need for financial resources to do this type of research so that you can produce materials that inform our own people and coming generations, but also those within government to understand that human rights isn't just a few copies of pages that enunciate what those rights are, but to bring them to life in a very, very different cultural context. And that financial resources come from outside of government. That the philanthropic community in particular begins to support Indigenous-driven research. I'll just point quickly to the fact that Inuit have been able to do extensive research projects in the area of food sovereignty and self-government, also on the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge, which has then created a springboard for us to influence the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as many, many other forces. So I just offer that as one. I have several solutions or ideas, but I offer that as one that I think is really crucial because it can and should be Indigenous driven.
Mahalo nui, Deli. That's so important. He who writes the history books controls history, right? When we do our own research, we can change our narrative. Anyone else on the panel would like to share?
Just like follow up like what Danny just mentioned, how important it is to have Indigenous-led research, to change the narratives. Because I just would like to share my own experience. When we started with Indigenous studies in Kaufman University, one of the priorities we have emphasized that whatever the reading materials for our students, let's focus on Indigenous-led research or Indigenous authors, so that the studies will not, story will be true to the ground, because often the stories and often the literatures we have found written by outsiders, there are a lot of gap, misunderstanding, miscommunications. Indigenous people often presented as vulnerable, as objects to be researched on, and something that they cannot have space for to speak their own thing. So we try our best to collect all the materials written by Indigenous people, no matter if we are published in big journal or not, but just stories, so that we can, our students will connect the reality, not being trapped with this modern Western worldviews where there's a little space for indigenous knowledge and system. When we started mapping out the literatures, we found hardly few in Asia, especially because we really tried to come up with the stories from Asia, because so that and it's more priority first from Nepal and then Asia and then globally. So ended up with a different literature from other North America and also Australia and New Zealand, because that was where the pool of research were more. But we hadn't found any from Asia. So that was the gap I found. Like it's so important to have indigenous-led research to bring the paradigm shift on reality to change the narratives. That was the lessons. And then separate Center for Indigenous People Research and Development is a organization focused on indigenous-led research, to research based on the CBMIS community-based monitoring information system. That system will empower, bring the research not just as an outsider, but go work with the community, help of the indigenous youth and elders come up their own stories. So that is the one of the tools that we have applied, and that has brought drastic changes in terms of bringing the own issues and concerns to be reflected up, and obviously on the IPSSDD people sustainable self-determined development approach. So we started doing on that kind of education, helping indigenous people to know what the strength they have, and even to have a negotiation with the local government. That part, that is, and then now because I'm involved, I'm also a teacher, teaching in Kathmandu University. So all the students, we try to make not just one based on a theoretical approach, but merge with the ongoing research for them to involve, so that they understand the upper reality, but also contribute on the ground reality to bring some changes happens on that part. No? And then, as I said earlier, also one of the main burning issues on the ground is continuation of this forest regime, where little space for indigenous peoples, and especially in the national park. I gave you example from India, but I also want to give you example from Nepal, like Bardi and Sugakhara National Park, where we had recently working very closely with the city and also my colleagues in the separate. So it's a really, really painful story again. In the people, indigenous people who are displaced from the core team with the false promises, no space to move on. So, in the whole community, like more than 70 households in one sectors where they displaced, you hardly find youth after 13 years. And I asked after, the elders, where's the young generation? And most of the 99%, they go for cheap labors, either in the city or India, because there's no income. The access to the resources and the land is completely restricted with the bullets by the armies. So, and the young generation having hope for continuity of your value is completely lost, so jeopardized. And this is where we really need to talk it, that how important collaboration, funders, bringing all the attention, how important to work with the indigenous peoples to bring the real issues and concerns, and policy-based and evidence-based policy advocacy for recognition of their human rights, for fundamental rights, for living their traditional knowledge and practices, and so that will be the basis for maintaining the faith in solidarity.
Thank you. Thank you for saying so important. Collaboration. Yes, collaboration. Abed?
For us to think strategically about advancing the rights of indigenous people, I'll focus on 3 examples.
Really,
So Billy mentioned already, but I just want to highlight it again. It's capacity building of indigenous-led organizations and the community. Second, it's investing in our youth and our future generations. That's paramount.
Третье – это общение, работа с
Third, it's strengthening our engagement with and our work with our strategic partners. So that's first of all, human rights organizations, NGOs, and environmental groups. Scientists.
Thank you. Mahalo.
Yeah, one thing I just, of course, agree with everything that's just been shared. So I'll add some that maybe haven't been touched upon. One is also continuing to normalize the situation of Indigenous peoples in the mainstream. And that means also in the creative sectors, helping to support our creative peoples. In the United States, we've seen some advancement, for example, in television programming with a show called Reservation Dogs and some other programming that give it a view of Indigenous peoples in the current context. Oftentimes we hear or we understand as we engage with others outside the communities that Indigenous peoples are often relegated to the past. I remember talking about, I'll give you an example. My ancestors were the very first Indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere to be called Indians. However, even today, the imagery of the Western Plains Indian supersedes who we really are. In other words, when they think about Indians, even in our region, their minds are going to the Western Plains, the romanticized time in American history, right? Linked with Manifest Destiny. And so they're not even looking at us the way we're supposed to be looked at. They don't see us as wearing clothes. Like, in other words, our people would have to be naked, painted red, and walking around in feathers for them to acknowledge us in the way that they see us in their minds. However, if we did that, we would be arrested, right, in certain contexts. So understanding who we are, and that's why for me, I've been working with some well-known musicians who have started acknowledging before they take the stage. Some Grammy Award-winning musicians, before they take the stage, they invite Indigenous peoples to do a welcome in whatever city they're from before they take the stage. Maybe it's a 3-minute, but that provides in that moment an opportunity for all those mainstream young people to get a vision of Indigenous peoples as they are. This is just a creative idea that helps to normalize who Indigenous peoples are as human beings today in a current context. That's something there that we can do. So supporting the arts, supporting Indigenous peoples' inclusion in these other arenas outside of what we would normally be into, human rights, et cetera, but also including the arts in that and in mainstream and in media, et cetera. But of course, highlighting so that's one. But again, I would say that also support in the legal areas. So many of our peoples get bogged down in legal battles that they just don't have the capacity to sustain when they're confronted, especially with multinational corporations, et cetera. So I think that those are the two additions that I just wanted to add along with what my relatives have already shared.
Mahalo, Louis. Great and oh no, English. Delicious discussion that we've been having. Before I turn the remaining section over to Elsa, I just want to, where's the camera there? Speak to our allies. Get to know us better. Get to know us. We're here. We appreciate the support. We don't need to be fixed, but we do need you standing by our side. The more you get to know us, the more you understand how you can help us, how we can help you, how we can come into community together. You know, we also appreciate many resources, like I neglected to say thank you earlier, as you folks did, but to the Ford Foundation for providing us this forum, this opportunity to share our words. And to the funders, please consider bringing Indigenous peoples onto your staff and allowing them the opportunities to start helping you make the decisions from our standpoint on how we can attain our own self-determination with your support and with your help. Now that we got that one out there, definitely don't want to forget our allies, because we have many. We have many allies, and we have many that don't know their allies yet. I call them the fence sitters. They're sitting on the fence, not yet hearing our voices, but when they do, we know that they'll be very, very willing to support. And with that, we'll turn the last question over to Elsa. How can intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations enhance their support to Indigenous peoples to achieve meaningful action towards the actuation of our rights?
Thank you for this, and I am very inspired by the previous speakers. I confirm my understanding as you have shared, dear colleagues. Indigenous people from the beginning came to the UN because they were looking for something. So they wanted the UN to be, can I use this word, mediator, or to do good work, set a good example. So they saw that there was an interest in that. And therefore, a number of things have been created because of Indigenous advocacy about it. And the first one has to do with norms. Again, going back to norms. If we go to our Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we see that there are two articles, 41 and 42, that address specifically the obligation of intergovernmental organizations. They mentioned the Permanent Forum explicitly in one of the articles, 42, to push for the full implementation of the declaration, also through funding, through participation of Indigenous peoples, and specific actions. In other words, it is interesting and exceptional, again, that in our declaration, you see a norm that addresses itself to the intergovernmental, interstate organization, not just to states, but also to interstate organizations. So in terms when, and I think Daly and also Roberto mentioned, so about the validity, the legal validity of the declaration. That's very important because when the Permanent Forum in the year 2009 discussed what would be its role in pushing for the implementation of the declaration, according to Article 42, where it's mentioned, they also made a statement about the legal validity of the declaration. And they said that the declaration forms part of universal human rights law. So it is part of it. It's not just something on the side, in the corner. And the forum also made clear that the declaration is the basis and measure of all actions by the intergovernmental organizations about Indigenous people's rights. And then came a policy framework. I will be brief. I hope to stick to 5 minutes. And the policy framework, the first thing for me to flag is that there is, again, because Indigenous peoples pushed and convinced, there is an interagency support group on Indigenous peoples issues at the United Nations. It started just with 7 organizations in the year 2002. And now it's about 40 of them, which shows that there is more on the, not just on the fence, right? I think Daly mentioned, but there are people getting involved now, organizations getting involved. And what is also interesting, I think, for us politically to notice is that not just of the UN system, but you also have outside the UN system. For example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is one of them, that has become member of this interagency support group. And the other thing is that the Permanent Forum is pushing for each of these agencies to have a focal point on Indigenous issues, a focal point with funding, and a focal point with a work program So, there is a constant push. And if we look carefully, all of us, and the advocates, the indigenous advocates, every year the agencies give detailed reports. Many agencies actually write and say what they have done. So it is an opportunity for the forum and for the advocates to say, hey, are you doing this well? You're doing it less well. I need to tell you about it. And I want to finish by talking about good examples. What is a good example, And studies that we have done at the United Nations together with our indigenous organization colleagues and organizations show us that good examples have within them organically the substantive participation of indigenous people. Without that, the programs are not adequate, are not sustainable. This has been again and again proven, and I can tell you where we did that also by doing examples on indigenous of international work with indigenous women around the world. I want to finish this by saying that we have noticed a huge participation gap. We noticed at the ground level regarding Millennium Development Goals. Is it going to get better with the Sustainable Development Goals? Still needs to be proven. We don't know that. We have to be very strict, I think, all of us, because can agencies do better? Yes, and they should. Having worked there for a long time, I can say that. Yes, there is some good, general goodwill, but in order to do it substantively, you really have to commit yourself. I want to finish, my friends, with just some words because it's the youth that presents, the hope for the future. And there is the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus at the Permanent Forum that is so present and so exciting. Whenever they take the floor, you can hear a pin drop. So there is, they have a coordinating committee, and in 2019, the coordinators wrote a very beautiful text. We co-edited a book about indigenous youth with them. And they say this, it's a little excerpt. It says, we indigenous youth have listened to the stories of our elders, and we remember that we are the guardians of the forest. We are the protesters that stand for water rights, the sisters who demand environmental change in a world that is simultaneously melting and drowning, the brothers who advocate for policy change in a world that is plagued by droughts and floods, the communities who combat hunger and corruption. We are the survivors who are healing after the rape of our people and our lands, who to this day are fighting the people and corporations who want us gone for the sake of profit. Our roots remain strong. We are sprouting and growing, and we want you to witness our hybrid flowers blossoming. We demand the acknowledgement of our space in the contemporary world as young, indigenous, and living. Indigenous youth are not a relic of the past. Rather, we are the promise of a better future. I leave you with these words. Thank you very much.
I love that. I love those words that we end with from our Indigenous Youth Caucus, or how we can also call them our future elders. So, yeah, one last comment?
We wanted to offer a small gift also before we close. Thing for you.
Please. And that is the best closing.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so thankful Cultural Survival and for Foundations. Thank you for having us. So I would like to sing a song in my native language, Tagalog language. This song is about our connection with nature, how we see us and nature united.
И дочь ручья, сестра полей, я сын тайги, брат зверей, твои глаза синика, мои глаза два удалека, твой голос звонкий ручаю, твой голос гордый. Сия зигая, и пока
It's a beautiful way to bring our time together to a close. On behalf of Cultural Survival and then the Ford Foundation, we thank everyone for coming together today, especially for our panelists for making your time and traveling these ways to come together. We share the important- And
Over time by 4 minutes, and I know there's activity in this room again, but I think, does anyone have any questions? Maybe we can keep talking until they kick us out. If there are questions. We can just chat. Sure. So if everyone can just repeat where they're from, their community.
maybe we start with Sally.
Dolly, did you hear that on the?
Uvanga-
you could
Uvanga Napaliak, which is my Inuit name, and from originally the community of Unalakleet in Northwest Alaska or Norton Sound. So Aninuk, Rihanna.
Aloha nui o waho i ke au kai mana o nā lani. E kama ho i ke ia no ka aina o Hawaii, a o mauna kea ku mauna o waia kea ku wai, o kuhio ku kai, o hokuala kai ku wa. Aloha, I'm Kaimana Bakarsi from the islands of Hawaii. Mauna kea is my mountain, waia kea are my waters, kuhio is my ocean, and hokuala kai is my canoe.
My name is Elsa Stamatopoulou, and I am from Greece, born in Athens, Greece.
Asam Dolma Serpa. So I'm one of the indigenous peoples from the mountain. Asam means my language is Friday. I was born on Friday from Nepal.
Taigwe, dito. So greetings, sister. Diri Mukaro Aguevana, Boriken Taino Daka. My name is Roberto Mucaro Borrero, and I'm a citizen of the Guainía Taino tribe from Boriking and the U.S. Virgin Islands, so from Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands.
name is Pavel Solindiga. I'm from the Udege people who are native to Russian region in Siberia.
Oh, thank you, everyone. We can probably
Thank you.
continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming. If you're not familiar with Cultural Survival, we're a nonprofit organization based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Really appreciate your attention today to our fabulous panelists. Thank you to the panelists for joining us and sharing your wisdom and expertise that you've all gained after many, many years of doing this work. So appreciate your work and your time today. Please, everyone, take a magazine there for you to take home. There's one on some chairs, and there's also some other additions on the table in the back there. We are in our end of year fundraising season. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please support our work so we can continue to do this work and answer the call that all of our panelists have made today about the future work that needs to happen to implement Indigenous rights. So check out our website, www.cs.org. Thank you so much.
Daily.
We'll take a group photo with you and do this.
Okay, let's take a.